On the morning her sister married the man she loved, Eleanor Ashcombe learned how quietly a heart could be shamed. The bells of St. Bartholomew's rang with jubilant insistence, their peals tumbling through the pale autumn air, while she stood beneath the great stone archway and felt herself shrink into the margins of the day. Silk skirts whispered around her, pale gloves brushed past her arm, and yet no one met her gaze for long. They had already decided what she was. The eldest sister, unwedded 8 and 20, a reminder that youth was brief and mercy rarer still. She wore dove gray, chosen not for beauty but for restraint. Her gown bore no embroidery that might invite notice, no daring cut that might provoke comment. Eleanor had learned, over years of watchful silence, that excess invited cruelty. As she took her place upon a side pew, the murmur of society swelled like an approaching tide. She heard her name, always softened by pity or sharpened by amusement. So devoted, one voice sighed. So unfortunate, another replied. Eleanor kept her chin lifted, her hands folded, her expression serene enough to pass for indifference. At the altar stood Clara, her younger sister, radiant in ivory satin, a vision of triumph framed by flowers and candlelight. Clara's smile dazzled, confident and untroubled, as though happiness had always been her rightful inheritance. The guests leaned forward as one body, eager to witness perfection affirmed. Eleanor watched too, though each breath felt borrowed. She remembered Clara as a child, laughing in the garden, forever reaching for what Eleanor had already surrendered. Love, she had told herself then, was not a finite thing. She knew better now, and beside Clara stood Alexander Montrevel, Duke of Ravenshollow, the most sought-after gentleman in 3 counties and the most dangerous, if whispers were to be believed. His presence altered the air, lending weight to every pause and syllable. He was composed to the point of severity, dark hair brushed back, features carved by restraint. Eleanor had once thought his gaze unyielding. She had been wrong. She had seen it soften in quieter rooms, when no one watched and words remained unsaid. The ceremony unfolded with reverent precision. Vows were spoken, promises exchanged, and Eleanor listened as though from a great distance. Her thoughts drifted, treacherous and unbidden, to a winter evening 2 years before, when Alexander had offered her his arm in a draughty gallery and spoken of duty as if it were a burden borne alone. He had looked at her then, searching, as though she held an answer he dared not claim. She had answered with silence, believing silence the kinder choice. Now silence pressed upon her again, heavy and public. As the clergyman pronounced them man and wife, a ripple of satisfaction passed through the congregation. This was how stories were meant to end, they thought. Beauty rewarded, alliances secured, futures settled. Eleanor felt a strange calm settle over her sorrow, a practiced endurance that wrapped itself around her spine. She would survive this too, she told herself. She always had. Then, in the moment before the final blessing, something shifted. Alexander lifted his head, and his gaze moved, slowly, unmistakably, away from his bride. Across the space between pews and petals, his eyes found Eleanor. The contact was brief, a single heartbeat suspended in time, yet it struck her with the force of confession. In his expression lay not triumph, nor relief, but a sorrow so naked it startled her breath away. The world seemed to hold still, as though the chandeliers themselves had paused to listen. Eleanor's fingers tightened in her lap. No one else appeared to notice. Clara remained smiling, the guests remained rapt, and the vows concluded as ordained. Yet something irrevocable had passed between Eleanor and the man at the altar, something that could not be unlearned. It was not longing alone that she saw in his eyes, but recognition of her, of himself, of a choice made too late. As the bells rang again and the assembly rose in celebration, Eleanor remained seated for a fraction too long. She felt the familiar cloak of invisibility settle upon her shoulders, but beneath it burned a dangerous awareness. She was not merely the forgotten sister, the dutiful shadow. She was the keeper of a truth that had no place in this sanctified hour. And as she stood at last, smoothing her gloves with deliberate care, Eleanor understood that this marriage, so applauded and admired, had been built upon a silence that would not remain obedient forever. The procession began its measured retreat down the aisle, and Eleanor rose with the others, moving as though guided by memory rather than will. Sunlight broke through the high windows now, striking the jewels in Clara's veil and scattering brilliance across the stone floor. Applause followed, polite and sustained, the sound of approval made ritual. Eleanor joined it, her palms meeting softly, each motion an act of discipline. She caught fragments of conversation drifting like thistledown, speculation about estates, admiration for the Duke's composure, relief that the Ashcombe girls were at last properly settled. Not one voice wondered what had been lost to achieve such order. When the doors opened and the guests spilled into the churchyard, the air changed again, carrying the scent of damp earth and crushed flowers beneath polished shoes. Eleanor lingered at the threshold, watching Clara accept embraces and praise, watching Alexander bow his head to congratulations with practiced grace. For a moment, he turned as if to seek her once more, then checked himself, his jaw tightening in silent resolve. The restraint in that small gesture told her more than any declaration could have done. It told her that whatever lay between them was neither imagined nor finished, but deliberately bound, waiting its hour. Eleanor stepped into the light, unaware that the silence she carried would soon demand payment, and that the wedding bells had not finished tolling for her yet, this day alone still. In the days that followed the wedding, Eleanor Ashcombe discovered that absence could be louder than any insult. Ravenshollow House filled with guests, their laughter echoing through corridors heavy with velvet and history, yet she moved among them as though muffled by glass. Servants bowed, ladies nodded, and conversations politely bent away from her presence. She was no longer an object of pity but an inconvenience, a reminder of something unresolved. Even Clara, now Duchess of Ravenshollow, greeted her with a brightness that felt rehearsed, her affection measured and oddly vigilant. Eleanor took refuge in routine. Each morning she walked the eastern terrace where roses, newly planted to celebrate the marriage, strained toward a hesitant son. Each afternoon she read in the small withdrawing room, choosing volumes that required concentration, as though discipline alone might quiet her thoughts. She told herself that what she had seen in the church was a momentary weakness, a trick of sentiment sharpened by grief. Yet memory would not be commanded. Alexander's gaze returned to her unbidden, unsettling her composure with its quiet gravity. The first token arrived without ceremony. A book lay upon the table beside her chair one afternoon, its leather worn soft with age. She recognized it at once, though she had not seen it in years. A volume of essays on duty and conscience, one they had discussed during a long-ago conversation by candlelight. No note accompanied it. No servant claimed responsibility. Eleanor's breath caught as she traced the familiar marginalia, the careful script that once had answered her questions in silence. Her hands trembled, not with joy, but with the fear of being seen. She tried to return it, but opportunity evaded her. Alexander was everywhere and nowhere, present at dinners, absent from intimacy, his attentions fixed upon his bride with impeccable correctness. Clara appeared content, though a brittle edge had crept into her laughter. Eleanor watched her sister closely now, noting how her eyes followed Eleanor's movements, how her smiles tightened when conversation lingered too long. The house itself seemed alert, as though the walls had learned to listen. What should have been a harmless kindness began to feel like a provocation. Whispers followed. Eleanor heard them in the pauses between compliments, in the slight hesitations before her name. A kindness too conspicuous was always suspect, and restraint too perfect invited curiosity. Matters worsened when a storm arrived without warning one evening, drenching the grounds and sending guests scattering indoors. Eleanor, caught between galleries, returned to her chamber chilled and breathless, only to find a shawl laid neatly across her bed. It was heavy silk, lined with wool, unmistakably chosen with her comfort in mind. She sat upon the edge of the mattress, the weight of it more troubling than the cold. At dinner that night, a careless remark sharpened into cruelty. A visiting cousin spoke lightly of Eleanor's future, wondering aloud whether she might now retire permanently to the countryside. The table laughed, indulgent and unthinking. Before Eleanor could summon her practiced smile, Alexander's voice cut cleanly through the mirth. He reminded the speaker, with impeccable calm, that Miss Ashcombe's presence was a distinction to any house. The rebuke was gentle, devastating, and entirely public. Silence followed, thick and astonished, and Eleanor felt every gaze turned toward her. Clara's hand tightened upon her wineglass. Her eyes flickered to Eleanor, then back to her husband, searching his face for reassurance that did not come quickly enough. The conversation resumed, but something had fractured. Eleanor's dignity, long ignored, had been acknowledged by the one man whose regard mattered most, and society recoiled from the implication. Later, as the guests withdrew, Eleanor caught sight of Clara standing alone by the hearth, her expression sharpened by suspicion and hurt. Sisterhood, once effortless, now stood poised on a precipice. That night, Eleanor found a letter slipped beneath her door. The seal bore the Montrevel crest, pressed into dark red wax. Her pulse quickened as she held it, the paper heavier than it ought to have been. Inside, the words were spare and formal, requesting a brief conversation on a matter of urgency to take place in the small library after the household retired. No explanation followed. No sentiment softened the request. Eleanor read it twice, then folded it with care, her thoughts racing between caution and a longing she had sworn to master. Sleep eluded her. She lay listening to the house settle, to footsteps fading and doors closing, until Raven's Hollow seemed to hold its breath. Every instinct warned her of danger. A private meeting, however innocent its intention, could destroy what little protection she possessed. Yet the silence demanded response. The tokens, the defense, the unspoken tension between her and Alexander had already set events in motion. To refuse now would not restore the past. It would only deepen the mystery already forming around her. When the hour arrived, Eleanor rose and dressed with deliberate calm, choosing a gown of sober blue and fastening her hair with steady hands. As she stepped into the corridor, the letter's weight seemed to press against her heart. She did not know what confession or apology awaited her, only that the truth, once spoken, could never be contained again. And somewhere beyond the library door, she sensed that a secret, long restrained by honor, had begun to seek its own release. The library lay hushed beneath its domed ceiling, lit only by a single lamp whose flame trembled like a held breath. Eleanor entered softly, the door closing behind her with a decisive hush that felt like fate. Books lined the walls, witnesses older than scandal, and the scent of leather and dust wrapped around his senses. Alexander stood near the window, his back turned, hands clasped as though in prayer. When he faced her, formality shielded his expression, yet something restless stirred beneath his composure, demanding words long denied. Silence stretched, expectant, heavy, irrevocable, between them both at last tonight. He inclined his head with measured courtesy, addressing her as Miss Ashcombe, the title falling between them like a barrier. Eleanor answered with a curtsy precise enough to wound her dignity armor against the intimacy she feared. For a moment neither spoke, and the quiet magnified every unasked question. Rain tapped faintly against the glass, echoing her pulse. At last Alexander confessed that he had asked her there because silence had become unbearable, and because honor, once his refuge, had begun to feel like cruelty. The admission altered the air irrevocably around them both that night alone without witnesses present. Eleanor listened without interruption, her hands folded, her face composed, though each word struck with intimate force. He spoke of restraint learned too late, of choosing duty when desire had whispered otherwise. He admitted that he had loved her first, quietly, hopelessly, before obligation closed its fist around him. The confession did not thrill her, it hollowed her. She replied that love unacted upon became a burden, not a virtue, and that his choice had shaped her solitude as surely as any public rejection. Silence answered her, dense with consequence and irrevocable understanding settled slowly between their guarded hearts tonight. Alexander's composure fractured then, not into desperation, but remorse. He told her of pressure from family, of debt's master's honor, of Clara's knowing consent. At that name, Eleanor's breath faltered. He confessed that Clara had understood his affection elsewhere, yet accepted his hand regardless, trusting marriage to silence what love had begun. Betrayal took shape, not as cruelty, but as ambition dressed in innocence. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her certainty, the past rearranging itself with devastating clarity. Every remembered kindness acquired a sharper, painful edge that cut deeper than any spoken insult ever had before her soul. She turned away, seeking the shelter of a bookcase, steadying herself against its carved edge. Tears threatened, unwelcome and dangerous, but she mastered them with practiced resolve. She told him that truth, once revealed, demanded consequence, and that she would not be the quiet accomplice to a lie maintained for comfort. Alexander listened as though to sentence, accepting without protest. He said he sought neither forgiveness nor indulgence, only to place honesty where silence had festered, whatever ruin honesty might invite. The words settled heavily, irrevocable as law spoken at last without hope of retreat from their shared history together. Eleanor faced him again, her expression quieter, more dangerous for its calm. She asked what he intended to do with this truth now spoken. Alexander answered that he did not yet know, only that he would no longer allow her to be diminished by implication or omission. He vowed restraint still, but not erasure. His promise carried no romance, only resolve, and that steadiness unsettled her more than passion might have done. For the first time, the future appeared uncertain, and therefore alive. Its fragile promise frightened her deeply because choice had returned, unbidden after years of silence and endurance. A sound in the corridor startled them both, a distant footstep or settling timber. Reality pressed close again. Eleanor stepped back, restoring distance with careful grace. She reminded him that his wife remained his sister, and that any misstep would wound more than reputation. Alexander inclined his head, accepting the rebuke as deserved. He said nothing more, yet his restraint felt like a vow in itself. The lamp flickered, shadows shifting, as though the room conspired to remember what had been spoken. Each breath carried risk, each pause consequence they both now fully understood in their shared silence tonight alone. Eleanor left first, her footsteps measured, her pulse unsteady. The corridor felt longer than before, as though the house had expanded around her awareness. Every portrait seemed to watch, every door to conceal possibility. She realized that she had crossed an invisible threshold from ignorance into knowledge, and that retreat was no longer innocence but cowardice. What she had learned bound her to events yet unfolding. She carried the confession like a fragile flame, capable of illumination or ruin, depending on how it was revealed to a world hungry for spectacle and merciless toward quiet women who waited patiently long. Sleep evaded her again, though her mind felt sharpened, not raw. She understood now that Clara's marriage rested upon a foundation already cracked. Whether it would shatter depended not upon passion, but courage. Eleanor resolved nothing that night, yet resolution gathered within her like a storm held at bay. She would not seek scandal, but she would no longer shield deceit with her silence. Dignity, she realized, required action as much as endurance, and restraint could itself become a form of betrayal when used to protect unjust arrangements crafted by others without her consent or honest participation any longer now. Morning would come, and with its scrutiny sharpened by rumor and instinct. Eleanor sensed that the truth would not remain private forever. It never did in houses built upon watchfulness. As dawn approached, pale and insistent, she understood that she stood at the center of a story no longer content to whisper. Someone would speak, or something would be discovered, and the careful balance Clara relied upon would fracture. In that knowledge lay fear, but also an unfamiliar power, awakening at last that promised neither mercy nor retreat, only consequence, choice, and reckoning waiting just beyond the light of morning. Society gathered at Raven's Hollow as though summoned by instinct, sensing that something brittle lay beneath the polished surface. Chandeliers blazed above silk and uniform, scattering light across faces trained into pleasant expectation. Eleanor entered quietly, her presence registered with a pause rather than applause. She felt eyes measure her anew, not with pity now, but curiosity sharpened by rumor. Clara presided as duchess with practiced elegance, her smile fixed too carefully, while Alexander stood beside her, composed yet distant. The air hummed with anticipation, as if the evening itself waited for permission to exhale. Unspoken tensions threaded every breath there. Music swelled, conversations resumed, and Eleanor moved through the crowd with deliberate grace, aware that each step carried implication. Hands brushed her sleeve, greetings hovered unfinished, and courtesy bent away from intimacy. She felt Clara's attention upon her, watchful and sharp, a sister's affection strained by fear. When Eleanor inclined her head, Clara returned the gesture a fraction too slowly. Alexander avoided Eleanor's gaze entirely, his restraint conspicuous, his silence louder than confession. In that avoidance, Eleanor sensed resolve forming, and with it the danger that restraint might fail before the night surrendered to scandal and irreversible truth at last. Wine flowed, laughter lifted, and the dance floor filled with movement meant to reassure. Eleanor declined invitations politely, content to observe from the edge, where truths revealed themselves without disguise. She noticed Alexander's jaw tighten when Clara accepted praise for her fortune, noticed his attention fractured despite himself. A servant passed Eleanor a folded paper with studied indifference. She recognized the seal instantly. Her pulse quickened, but she did not open it, sensing that patience, once more, would determine the shape of what followed and whether silence would finally demand its price before all watching eyes could turn cool open. The moment arrived without ceremony. Clara laughed too loudly, a brittle sound that fractured the room's composure, and in that Fisher truth slipped free. The letter Eleanor carried fell from her reticule, its crest visible before she could stop it. A guest stooped to retrieve it, curiosity outrunning decorum. Murmurs rippled outward, recognition dawning. Clara's color drained, her gaze darting between Eleanor and her husband. Alexander stepped forward then, claiming the attention of the room with a gravity that stilled every whisper. Faces turned, breaths caught, expectation hardened into fearful attention as history paused briefly before irrevocable words followed him. He spoke not with passion, but with restraint sharpened into truth. Alexander declared responsibility for what had been concealed, for the affection misplaced and the silence sustained. He named Eleanor without flourish, acknowledging her dignity and his failure to protect it. The admission struck like a bell tolling inside the chamber. Clara gasped, her hand gripping the back of a chair, her composure splintering before witnesses. Eleanor stood unmoving, her expression calm, though her heart thundered with the sound of consequence finally arriving that no one could soften or dismiss now without dismantling the illusion entirely they had cherished blindly. Society recoiled, not from Eleanor, but from the rupture itself. Whispers collided, alliances recalculated, and sympathy shifted with ruthless speed. Clara faltered, her authority evaporating beneath scrutiny she could not command. Alexander did not reach for her, nor for Eleanor, choosing instead to stand alone within his confession. Eleanor felt something lift within her chest, a release born not of triumph, but of being seen without distortion. Shame loosened its grip, replaced by a steady resolve that astonished even her. At last for years she had endured invisibility as penance, never knowing release could feel so quiet and profoundly transformative. The evening dissolved into confusion, guests withdrawing with forced civility, conversations truncated by discomfort. Eleanor remained until courtesy permitted departure, her posture unwavering. Clara vanished from the room, escorted by anxious relations, her silence louder than protest. Alexander watched Eleanor from across the space, his expression unreadable yet intent. Nothing passed between them then, no gesture to inflame speculation. Yet the distance itself carried meaning, an acknowledgement that something irrevocable had been set in motion and could no longer be guided by decorum alone without further wounding those already exposed to the ruthless assessment of society that never forgot transgression. Eleanor stepped into the night air, cool and sharp, feeling the weight of eyes even as she left them behind. Carriages waited, horses stamping impatience into stone. She breathed deeply, grounding herself in the physical world, the gravel beneath her slippers, the scent of rain approaching. She understood now that resolution had begun, not ended. The truth spoken publicly could not be retrieved, only answered. Whatever followed would demand endurance of a different kind, one rooted in agency rather than survival, a choice she had been denied for years by love constrained and silence imposed until this irrevocable night alone. Behind her, Raven's Hollow glowed with false serenity, its windows bright against gathering darkness. Eleanor knew the house would not forget this evening, nor would its occupants. Reputation, once fractured, could not be mended by time alone. Clara's fate, Alexander's honor, and Eleanor's own future now lay exposed to judgment. Yet within that exposure, Eleanor sensed possibility, thin but real. She had spoken nothing, yet truth had spoken through her, and society had listened despite itself. This realization steadied her more than any vow ever offered by those fearing consequence in gilded rooms like these where silence once ruled unchallenged supreme. As her carriage door closed, Eleanor allowed herself a single unguarded breath. The night carried her forward, away from applause and accusation alike. She did not know how Clara would answer this rupture, nor whether Alexander's declaration would endure scrutiny. She knew only that the careful balance maintaining that marriage had broken publicly, and fragments would fall where they might. Tomorrow would bring judgment, negotiation, and consequence. Tonight, Eleanor carried something fragile and new, the certainty that silence had ended, and whatever followed would no longer be chosen for her by duty, fate, or another's ambition alone again at last. Morning arrived with a pale decisiveness that left no room for retreat. Raven's Hollow woke subdued, servants speaking softly, doors closing with care, as though the house itself feared further fracture. Eleanor dressed without assistance, choosing simplicity not from humility but from resolve. She felt no triumph, only clarity. The truth had been spoken. Consequences must follow. Clara did not appear at breakfast, nor at luncheon. An absence now carried accusation. By afternoon, letters arrived bearing seals of family and law, their weight unmistakable. Alexander requested Eleanor's presence that evening, not by note, but through a messenger instructed to wait for reply. She agreed without hesitation. They met not in secrecy now, but in the long gallery, doors open, candles lit. He looked altered, stripped of ceremony, his authority tempered by humility. He told her the marriage would be dissolved, not quietly, but correctly, through law and acknowledgement. He accepted exile from favor, if required. He asked nothing of her yet. Eleanor listened, measuring his words not for promise, but for truth. She told him she would not be a remedy for his conscience, nor a prize reclaimed after damage done. She demanded time, distance, and the freedom to choose without pressure. Alexander bowed his head, receiving her conditions without defense. He said love offered without patience was merely another form of possession. In that moment, Eleanor recognized not the man she had loved, but the one capable of deserving her. Days turned into weeks. Clara departed Raven's Hollow under the protection of relations, her disgrace managed rather than denied. Society argued, then settled, as it always did. Eleanor returned to her family estate, where winter crept across the fields and silence became companion rather than burden. Letters came from Alexander, restrained, infrequent, respectful. She answered none, not from cruelty, but necessity. She was learning the shape of her own life unshadowed by comparison. Spring arrived softly. Eleanor had almost forgotten the sound of anticipation untainted by fear. When Alexander came to her then, it was without heraldry audience, alone, as a man seeking permission rather than absolution. He spoke plainly, offering partnership, not rescue. He asked if she would consider a future built slowly, publicly, without secrecy or sacrifice of self. Eleanor felt the final weight of her long endurance lift. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she told him who she had become, a woman no longer willing to disappear for harmony's sake. Alexander listened, truly listened, and when she finished, he knelt not in spectacle but humility. There was no ring yet, no promise demanded, only a vow to wait until her yes was freely given. Eleanor extended her hand, not in surrender, but invitation. Their engagement was announced months later, measured and unadorned, leaving society little room for invention. Eleanor returned to Ravenshollow not as shadow, but equal. Whispers followed still, but they no longer bent her spine. Clara remained distant, her silence a consequence neither sister pursued. Eleanor understood that healing did not require reconciliation, only honesty. She had been humiliated, overlooked, betrayed, yet she stood intact, her dignity sharpened by trial rather than diminished. On the day Eleanor married Alexander, no bells rang in defiance, only in quiet affirmation. She walked forward unashamed, knowing she had chosen love not at the cost of herself, but because of it. As vows were spoken, she did not search the room for judgment. She met Alexander's gaze and saw not regret, but gratitude. The world had not been kind, yet she had claimed her ending, and in doing so, transformed her beginning. Years later, when Eleanor was asked about scandal, she answered with serenity that scandal fades, but self-betrayal endures. She became known not as the sister wronged, but the woman who waited for truth and demanded more. Ravenshollow changed under her stewardship, softened by empathy, governed by fairness. Alexander never ruled above her, only beside her. Together they proved that love, when chosen freely and openly, could survive even the cruelties of a world that once thrived upon her silence. Eleanor sometimes remembered the girl in grey standing alone at a wedding altar, invisible and obedient. She did not mourn her, but honored her endurance. Without that suffering, she might never have recognized the power of refusal, the courage of patience, or the dignity of self-command. Her life did not become a fairy tale, but something stronger, a testament. Love did not rescue her. She rescued herself, and love followed. When society recalled the scandal, it remembered the Duke's confession and the broken marriage, but it forgot the quieter revolution. Eleanor's victory was not public sympathy, but authorship of her fate. She never again accepted silence as virtue when it masked injustice. In choosing truth, she altered the trajectory of every life bound to hers. That, more than any title or fortune, became her legacy. And so the story ends not with spectacle, but with balance restored. Eleanor Ashcombe, once overlooked, stood fully seen. The love she claimed was neither stolen nor begged, but earned through restraint and courage. In a world governed by whispers, she learned to speak. In a society that prized appearances, she chose substance. Her heart, once shamed in silence, found its voice at last, and the echo of that choice carried far beyond Ravenshollow, reshaping every life it touched. Yet even as peace settled, Eleanor understood endings were merely thresholds. Love required vigilance. Truth demanded courage anew each day. She and Alexander would face scrutiny still, but now together, unhidden. As twilight closed around Ravenshollow, Eleanor looked ahead without fear, knowing her worth was no longer granted by society, sister, or circumstance. It had been claimed. That knowledge, hard-won and enduring, became the truest vow of her life. In that quiet certainty, she stepped forward, not into legend, but into a future shaped by choice, honesty, and earned devotion, carrying the memory of pain not as wound, but as proof of the strength that had delivered her home at last safely whole.